now to practice 3-4. We're going to actually now move into the implementation, starting with the logic to retrieve the latitude and longitude coordinates. And so we'll go through and configure that particular connection following these instructions for invoking the first call to the application using that URI. So let's get started. Step one is we open our integration. Two ways to get that open up. You can just click on it here, or you can click here to edit. The instructions tell you to do this. Either way works. When you get back to your integration, you're in edit mode. And we need to hover our cursor just below the trigger line before the response goes out, right here, to make our first invocation. Under invocations now we can see there's one available connection to use for calling out. So let's do that as an invoke role. And we're expected to call it get coordinates. I'm going to paste that in. And just as an example, we gave you an example of providing a description. In this case, it's getting the latitude and longitude for a city. So it's very important that we get the right URI. This is, again, what is required for that external service from the base URL. We add this relative resource URI, and again, it is the get method that we're going to be calling. So let's make sure that since we didn't provide any template parameter, notice that this isn't checked yet automatically. If there was a template parameter, it would already be checked because it recognizes there's a parameter. But in this case, since we're going to use only query parameters, we need to actually click that so we can access that page, and click here so we can configure the response. Clicking continue now allows me to get to that first page where we want to add two query parameters. The first one, if we look at step 9, double click in here, is going to be called Q. I'm sorry. And the data type is a string. And then we add a second one. This is step 9, units. And this, in this case, this is also a string. And there's a screenshot here to validate that I've got this configured correctly. And at this point, we can click continue. So we're up to step 11. As always now, when we configure the response, typically, especially for REST, it's going to be JSON. And now I have an opportunity to select a file. And we saw this before. We got to make sure that we get the right one. Step 13 says it's the get coordinates response JSON. So this is something that I got from, to make it easier for you, this is the sample JSON file that I got from their website to make it easier for you to get that JSON response. And so when I click and bring that in and you look at it, you can see how there's a lot involved there. This is what that layout looks like for a JSON response back from the web service. So let's cancel out of that and leave the other fields as is. Click on continue. And as always, we can expand this endpoint summary to be able to see, yes, there's my two query parameters, and of course it's a get method. I got the service URI correct, and I can click finish. All right, so now that we have that in place, right below step 17, it talks about how, in addition to configuring the invoke, we now have a new map action that's been automatically added. Again, there's two ways to open this up. You can either double click it, as the lab instructions indicate, or as always, you can click on the ellipsis right here and click on edit. Either way, that opens up and loads the map editor. And here's where we need to now map data over into making the request. So first, in the sources, we expand the template parameters to expose the city. And over in the target, we expand the query parameters that are required for this. And it now needs the city element as this Q argument. That's what they call it. And then here I need to configure the units. Now, the units is something you're going to decide what you want to do. So the instructions say to right-click to create the target node. What this does is open up an expression editor. Notice it's in view only mode right now. So to edit in here, I click right here, this switch to developer view. And the lab instruction says, well, that the service is expecting one of two things, either imperial or metric. So I'm going to, because I'm in the US and I'm used to weather in Fahrenheit and not Celsius, I'm going to put in imperial. Make sure you type it correctly. Make sure you put your own double quotes in. Here's where a copy paste would not do you well. Now, if you are used to things in Celsius instead of Fahrenheit, then go ahead and use metric if that's what you're more comfortable with. All right, so either way, once you have that, we click on Save. And notice that it shows that mapping when you click on there. If I click on here, I just see the line with the expression for what that XPath expression is. Here, when I click on here, I can now see that that is actually a text that's been provided. So we click on Validate to finish up. We're going to close the mapper, or close the banner, and then exit the map editor by clicking the back icon. And we'll click Save to save our integration so far. And we'll see you in the next video. Let's continue now with practice 3-5 as we're finishing this implementation. This time we're going to configure yet another invoke action and essentially call the same weather service, but this time a different URI, as you can see here. So this will be very similar to what we just did in the previous invoke. Let's get started. So task 1 is to hover our cursor on the line below the get coordinates invoke. So we've already made one invoke and mapped to do that invoke. And now right below here is where we want to find that add icon. And again, we're going to go back to that same connection. I'm just now noticing that I mistyped my connection name and misspelled open. Oh well, that's okay. All right, let's call this get weather. And this is simply get the weather as the description. But what's really important is that we get the URI correct, because otherwise we won't be able to invoke the service correctly. Once again, after we've selected get, we have to indicate whether we want to add some query parameters. So we click there and also configure the endpoint response. So now when I click continue, on the specify parameters page, there's going to be 3 that we need to add. Starting with step 7, we're going to add LAT for the latitude, which is going to be a data type now of a float. Click add again for the longitude, LON. Again, these are expected by the service. That's also a float. And as before, we need to indicate the units of return, either imperial or metric. And let me spell it correctly, otherwise it will not work. And that is a string. All right, we'll click continue. This is step 10. And now for step 11, we configure the response again to be a JSON sample. And once again, we're going to provide the weather response this time, which again, we've got available for you in the resources section. So here it is. And again, if you want to look at it, you can see what that layout looks like for the JSON sample response. Click cancel. I'm going to click continue. And we reach our summary page where I can now see those 3 query parameters, make sure they're spelled right, and I can click finish. And once again, let's click save. You'll notice that it did again add a new map action just prior to the invoke that we just configured. So here we can click on edit or double click, which I'll do this time, to load the map editor. First, let's take a look now what we have available in our sources. Under get coordinates response, right? That's that data object. We expand this out to the response wrapper and top level array. And now we can see a lot of data elements available to me. So over here in target, it again needs those query parameters we configured, the latitude, the longitude, and the units. So for the mapping instructions, we're going to take that lat element for the latitude. We'll take the long element, which is the longitude. And once again, we're going to click on the units, right click, and create target node. Again, switch to developer node mode, and I will type in Imperial and click Save. And so your mapping should look like this. We'll now click Validate. Make sure we don't have a syntax error. Good. I can dismiss that banner, hit the Go Back arrow to exit the mapper, and that's it. We just click Save to save the integration so far. And we're done. We'll see you in the next video. All right, practice 3-6, we're going to wrap up our implementation by configuring the response mapping. Again, let's get started. So here we need to go to that get weather by city map element. All right, that's the one at the very bottom here. You can kind of see how this one still has some, you can tell it's not been implemented. See how it has these little dotted lines around it? You'll see something similar. Once they're configured, they're smooth, these little mappers, but this one hasn't yet been configured. Again, you can either double click it or click on edit. And in this case, we now have all the data we need to return our response back to the client. All this is, remember that this is that JSON sample that we're setting up for providing data back to our client of our integration. So with that, let's expand our sources. We'll start with the get coordinates response data object, and expand out the response wrapper and the top level array where we have that information. And then we have the response wrapper already expanded. So let's get the latitude element to set the lat element to latitude. Let's get the long element to the longitude. The country element is to be mapped to the country. Again, I'm just following the lab instructions, folks. Now, for the rest of this, it's going to come from another response. So what I like to do is just kind of get that one out of my way by closing it, and then we need to expand the get weather response. So let's do that. Here we go. And so under the response wrapper, we're now expanding weather, and we're going to drag the description over to the current weather. And then lower down, we need to expand main, and we're looking for the temperature. Temp gets expanded to current temperature. And finally, we need to collapse main. And lower down, we're looking for the name element, which is actually going to be the city. So let's drag that to the city. and we're done with our mapping. So as always, you're going to want to review your mapping to make sure that you didn't miss any values along the way. Now I can click Validate. There's the banner that confirms that, and we can click the Go Back arrow to exit the mapper. And with the mapping implemented, we can click Save, close the banner, close our integration with the Go Back error. And again, we're still in the configured state, but now we're done with our implementation. We'll see you in the next video. All right, finally, practice 3-7. We're completed with our implementation, so now it's time to activate and test. Follow along with me as I follow these instructions. So we're in the integrations panel. We're expected to now activate this integration. I click here to activate. And we want to, again, set it to debug so we can see all the tracing information that we need for validation, and click activate. As always, once the banner comes in, you'll see the activation in progress. If I refresh the page, eventually you'll see it into an active state. And by the way, if you ever refresh and it doesn't reach active yet, don't worry. Sometimes it just takes a few extra seconds for that to happen. All right, well, at this point now, we're ready to do a test. So if you recall, we click here to do a run. And now there's our URI, and there's our URI parameters, in this case, looking for a city. Now, we give you some suggestions for cities like New York and Chicago. As long as it's a major city, not some small town, it's going to work. I'm going to use New York. I should use my hometown. I'm going to use Tampa, Florida. So I think that's a major enough city, and I can now click Run. And sure enough, down, look at response. We have the 200 OK status response. Again, we have the layout of the JSON response as we indicated. And in case you're curious, that's what the weather here is in Tampa right now as I'm doing this demo. It's 71 degrees. All right, so with that in play, we can see the activity stream. As always, we invite you to explore a little more, and I'm not going to do it right now, but this is a lot of information that you can learn about. For example, when I made the first invocation, I can expand that out where I got my coordinates. When I made the second invocation, I can expand that out to look at the messages being sent and being received back from the external service. So we encourage you to play with that as much as you want. If you look at step 11, it now says, well, if you want to run an additional test, you can. And so for fun, I'll add another city. Let's go back to that New York that I was going to do and make another request. Feel free to make one or two more as you see fit. And now I can see that the temperature in New York right now happens to be 62 degrees, and it's clear skies, which is great. All right, so let's exit out of here. And at this point, what we want to do is we want to go to the track instances page to see what has happened. So remember, this takes us directly to the observe page and to the instances tab, where I can now see that these recent ones, and then again the last hour, are available. By the way, if you're curious, if you ever wanted to change that filter to say, well, what about other integrations like over the last, in this case, 3 days? When you apply that, it should have the other instances that have run prior to as well. If I take away the specific integration filter, so let me take that away. And yeah, you can see the other integrations that I ran from other lab exercises are still there. Now, I kind of messed myself up here. Let me change that filter back to the last hour, so we can just see the two that responded. And here's where you can now explore and see the details. Either one of them. I'll do this Tampa one. And again, you can see the path, and you can see an access to the activity stream once again. So I'm going to click back and click back one more time to the Design tab, following the instructions. What that's asking us to go ahead and deactivate our integration. So click on deactivate and confirm it. Close the banner. And as always, when we reach the end of a lab, we have a sort of a summary of the kind of steps that you did, including all the work that was required to get the API key, creating the connection, and then making a couple of calls to that external service within the new integration that we created. And this concludes Lab 3. Welcome to the overview for Lab 4, creating an integration to invoke an Oracle Fusion Cloud application. And our Oracle Fusion Cloud application is going to be Oracle CX Sales and B2B Service Cloud we'll be using for our example. As you can see, it's broken into 5 practices. I'll walk you through each of those, where we're essentially, after we've configured the adapter connection, create a new integration using that as the trigger. Using a REST adapter connection for the trigger, but then creating an Invoke connection to the Fusion application, mapping the data accordingly. Here's a high-level view of what this is going to look like. Now, the only prereq for this, as it mentions here, is that you have already set up a project, of course, and you already have that REST adapter connection you got from Lab 1. All right, let's take a look as we move into the first practice. See you in the next video. All right, we'll get started with practice 4-1. In this first practice, we're going to be creating the actual connection to the Fusion Cloud application. So the task beginning here with step 1 is to locate the URL and credentials, and we walk you through where and how to do that. Now, since my setup isn't exactly like yours is, I've simulated that the best I can. You're going to have a lab tab, and in there, you'll see the top section. It usually says something like OCIC credentials, which includes your username and password. You've already gotten that. Then down below is where you see Fusion credentials, and you'll notice there are 3 of them for 3 different Fusion apps: the CX Sales Cloud, the HCM Cloud, the ERP Cloud. This is the one we need right there, along with those credentials. So I'm going to be using that. The instructions say for you to kind of get those handy so you can use them for copying and pasting. Instead, I'll start here with task number 2, opening the Service Console, and we'll go ahead and create this connection. Let me get those credentials handy so I can copy and paste them. Here we go. So we're going to go over back to the projects, opening up our project, and then creating a new connection. And we're going to search for CX, which is our Oracle CX Sales and B2B Service Cloud. And the name we're supposed to give for this is simply Oracle CRM. And in this particular use case, the instructions tell us to use the trigger and invoke role. Now, technically, for this particular lab, we're going to use it in the invoke role, but for other labs or other scenarios, you could also use it in the trigger role. So we're going to go ahead and select both, which is a common scenario when you're dealing with Fusion Cloud applications. Click on Create, which will now bring us into the configuration page for the URL properties and the security. So here's where we're going to copy and paste that Fusion URL that I just illustrated to you a moment ago. There it is. And then the instructions say to use the username, password, token policy. Notice for most Fusion apps, they also support the OAuth authorization code credentials policy. We won't be doing that for this lab. And there we just need the username and password. So let's copy those in from my saved file. And there's the password. And if you're not sure you copied it right, you can click on here just to make your password visible. All right, so the next step is to test the connection. And if you make a note here in the lab instructions, we kind of warn you it could take 30 to 40 seconds for this connection testing to complete. So we're going to be patient and wait for that testing to be finished, waiting for that test confirmation banner. And there's our banner. Next step is to save it. And this can also take a little bit of time as well. We'll be patient and wait for that save confirmation banner. And there it is. We'll close that. Now we can exit with the go back arrow. And there is our new connection in a configured state. We'll see you in the next video. All right, moving on to practice 4-2. Here we're going to go ahead and create our new integration. And we're going to define an interface for it. As you recall from the setup, this is going to be an integration available to any REST client that's going to access our integration. And in this case, they're going to retrieve some account information that we're going to actually later on fetch from the Oracle CX Sales and B2B Service Cloud. So I'll be following these tasks, beginning with task number 1. Let's get that out of the way and let's get started. So we're going to create a new integration by clicking the plus icon, using create as our option, the application pattern as our choice, and the name they wanted us to use for this, I will copy and paste in here, is retrieve CRM account info, which is essentially what this thing is doing. Click on create. And now we need to define the trigger. Notice since we've added the Oracle CRM in the trigger and invoke role, it shows up as an available trigger, but that's not our use case here. Our use case is to reuse that REST trigger that we created back in Lab 1. And this time we just need to define what kind of relative URI it should provide. And so the instructions, first, I'm sorry, we need to go ahead and name this thing. I was jumping ahead of myself here. There we go. Now we can copy and paste that relative URI. And as a reminder, this is up to us to design what this should look like. So just came up with this little design and deciding that they can send in an ID as a template parameter. So as always, you need to now decide which additional pages you want to do for configuration. We need to configure the response, so we check that box. We see that the ID automates to a string. In this case, that's good for us. So we're going to move on and click continue. And as we've seen in other examples, we are going to stick with the JSON as our response format. And once again, the instructions will have you navigate to where let me go back to there. There we go, to our lab resources. And we need to, this time, provide get the get account info response JSON. And there it is right there. Again, we've provided this for you so you don't have to make up your own design yourself. This is what we came up with. We would retrieve this information and provide that from the Fusion application. So that's what our sample looks like. I'll click on cancel since it's already been inputted, and we click continue. So we've reached the summary page, and there's not much here other than to review the fact that we've got our template parameter of the ID, and we click finish. All right, so with that configuration completed, let's go ahead and save that initial trigger work that we did. And now it's time to configure the business identifier. Starting in step 21, for the identifier, we're going to take in that template parameter. And this time, instead of just letting it be called ID, we give a more meaningful name. And so the instructions are say, well, let's go ahead and call that instead an account ID, because that's what it is. So we click on Save to close that box and save the integration. And with that, we can go back. And we've completed that practice. We'll see you in the next video. Continuing now with practice 4-3. So at this point, we're now ready to invoke the Fusion application using that connection that we've already created in an earlier practice, and we'll configure it along with its mapping. So we'll start here with task 1. I'm going to move this out of the way. In the integrations panel, we want to open this up for editing again. Where we want to do this is right after the trigger element, so I drag right here to add this in place. And we're going to select the Oracle CRM connection. Now we need to provide a name for this endpoint. We are suggesting that you call it Get Account Resource. So I'll paste that in and click Continue. Now, at this point, we have some options here. We can configure an operation as a business object, or browse for services, or browse for REST resources. In this particular example, we're going to go with the business REST resources, which now gives me an option to select one of the service apps. And yes, we're going to want the CRM REST app, but if you'll notice, we also have the application for HCM, since that's part of this description, and we also have ERP Cloud. But for this use case, we're going to hit the CX Sales Cloud. Selecting that now, we're going to go ahead and locate accounts. Now, I can find it here by just searching for it, scrolling to it, but if you needed to, you could always start typing in a word that gets close to what you're looking for, and it'll search through the business objects much faster. And by the time I get to accounts, there's only one actual just accounts. We select that. And now below that, we need to decide what kind of operation we're going to be doing. The instructions say that we want to do a get, so we will. And we click Continue. Now, this account resource has child resources, and if this use case required more information to retrieve from the CX Cloud, yeah, we'd have to choose one or more of these by selecting one and then moving it over, that sort of thing. But that's not our use case here, so let's keep that empty since that's all we need, and click Continue. So on our summary page, we're simply working on a get operation for accounts. Click Finish. And as always, once that's there, we want to save our integration so far. And we can see now that the mapper has been added, and its dotted line means it hasn't been implemented yet, which is exactly what we want to do now. So this time we're going to double click that guy, bringing the map editor into play. And this is going to be real easy. The instructions say to expand our template parameters to reveal that ID. And under the notice on the right on template parameters, that particular REST resource coincidentally needs an ID. Happens to be just what we have that provided by our client. So that mapping is easy. And if you'll notice under query parameters, we didn't define any, but there are some standard ones that can be provided if we ever needed to do dynamic additional query parameters. So I click on Validate. That validates the mapping. We can now exit the mapper. Our map is configured, and now we can save the integration. And we're done with this practice. We'll see you in the next video. Let's continue with practice 4-4. And in this one, we're just simply going to focus on implementing our response mapping. Should be real easy to do. Again, we'll start with that get account mapper element we left off with. So we go here. There's the get account info map element. I'm sorry. Yeah, get account resource. Get value info is down here. That's the response. Edit. And so the instructions say we need to expand the results that we got back from the get account resource response, and we expand get response, and then we can expand count to see all the various data elements available there. Under target, remember that response wrapper that we defined with the JSON response, and the instructions now give us information as to what and how to map things. Now, one of the things that you can do is use this to search for a certain field, so we might do that if we need to. A couple of these will be easy to find though. Party ID is right there at the top, which goes to the party ID. And then we're going to look for organization name. That's also close to the top, so we'll select that and drag that over to org name. Contact email, let's see. Now we're starting to, oh, it's right there. So I found it easy enough, but sometimes these are really, really long data objects and hard to find things. We're now looking for taxpayer identification. Goodness gracious, this looks like it's down a ways. There it is, identification number, which goes to tax ID. And then there's the URL element. I might have passed that. In fact, I'm going to show you an example of using this now. Type URL and hit return, and it takes me right to it. So that needs to map to the URL element. Now we're looking for address line 1. That's additional address. Let's go ahead and type that one in. There we go. Address line 1 needs to go to the address element, and I'll bet city is near there. Sure enough, city to city, state to state. Postal code is going to zip. And I think that's all of them. Yeah, we have them all. So moving on in my instructions, it says it's time to go click on validating. But we're going to do that now. In step number 6, it shows you how to use this filter tool, and I'm going to show you that now. So when we click on this little filter element, you can decide what you want to look at. So for source, let's just change that to the ones that have been mapped and click apply. So now notice my view allows me, when I expand down to account, I'll just see the account items that we have mapped, and we can see where they've been mapped to. It's easy enough. So moving past this, if you need to check further or make any changes, you would do that here by changing this back to all, so you could fix any of your mappings that you needed to do from that point. In our case, we know that we're correct. I click on validate, close the confirmation banner, exit the mapper with that arrow, and then save our integration. And since we're done, we can go ahead and return to the projects page. Okay, we'll see you in the next video. Okay, our final practice in this lab obviously takes us to 4-5, where we're going to be activating and doing some testing. And what we'll do here is just, again, walk through the tasks as they are, and occasionally we will have some screenshots to show you what it should look like. So let's get started here. The first task, as always, is to go in and activate our integration. And I want to choose debug as always, and then activate. Closing the banner. Activation is in progress. Let's refresh that until it's active, and it's active now. All right, so next step is to go in and execute at least one run. And we've kind of gotten used to seeing what this REST test page kind of looks like. We've provided a valid ID that I'm going to provide now to paste in. And if all works correctly, if our mapping was successful, we should see a response that looks something like this. And sure enough, because that's the same ID, the only thing difference is obviously the instance ID is unique since we just ran it. All right, well, we have that response. According then to our instructions, we can go into the activity stream, and we can look at information along the way. For example, what happened when we invoked it. We sent this information and so forth. Of course, you can, at this point, the instructions say you can try some different values. Just for fun, let's just try a couple of those. Here's a valid ID. Let's run that one. And we get that back to that information. And let's just do one more. When I click on run, wait a few seconds. What's happening is we accessed our integration. Our integration took in the information. It makes a call to the Sales Cloud and returns the information which we have now mapped into this response. And as always, now that we've finished testing, we can click on Track Instances to take us directly to this page that filters out for just instances within the last hour from this particular integration. And we can see the three use cases that I just ran. But clicking in on any of them, I'll just do for the first one, allows you to see the view of the progress of which activities took place. And anytime you want to drill further, you just kind of click on one of them. It'll draw your attention to where that, whoops, let me click on that again. I lost it here. Let's open this back up again. There it is, activity stream. And we can kind of see that get account resource, the message that was received by them. And we can see the message that was sent back from them. And there's all the data that we could have taken a look at if we were interested in, but we were only interested in mapping some of that data back to our client. So the lab instructions tell us to go ahead and click go back to get out of here. And to clean up, we have to go back to our design tab. We're going to deactivate our integration so we don't leave it running. Once again, it's in a deactivation state. We go ahead and click refresh, and it's back to configured. And we've reached the end where the summary reminds us of what we got done. We created a new connection resource now with both the trigger and invoke role. Then we've created a new integration, configured the connection to call, in this case, obtaining an account object as a REST resource, and then map the data accordingly. This ends Lab 4. All right, welcome to the overview for Lab 5, creating a SOAP trigger integration to invoke a SOAP web service. And in this particular exercise, it's broken into 5 different sections or practices. And if we look at the diagram, I just kind of want to draw your attention to the fact that the whole purpose of this exercise is mainly to show you how to configure access for a SOAP adapter connection to a SOAP-based web service. And we happen to choose our trigger for this to be a SOAP client. We could have continued to use a REST client if we wanted to, but since you've already done a bunch of those, we thought we would switch gears and also show you how to configure a SOAP client. There's no requirement that the type of client to your integration has to match with whatever you're going to. If you recall, in an earlier lab, we went to a Fusion application and we decided to use a REST client interface. So any combination of triggers and invokes can be used depending on what your use case needs to set up. So let's finish the review then of this particular lab. There's several steps to include. One of them is you'll need a testing tool. So we're going to have some instructions to show you how to install the SOAP UI open source testing application. That's the one I'm going to use for my demonstration, but you can use any one that you want. We'll just provide instructions for that. So overall, in addition to creating a SOAP trigger and also configuring a SOAP connection to external third-party third-party SOAP application, we'll show you then how to activate that and then use a SOAP testing tool. So a lot to learn here. And again, the only important prerequisite is that you've had Lab 1 completed. This completes the overview. We'll see you in the next video. Starting now with practice 5-1, we'll create that new connection resource that will be used as essentially a WSDL-based interface for the integration. And we've kind of done some of the work for you because typically it's also involving designing the abstract WSDL. We didn't want to take the time to do something so generic as that, since this is an OIC integrations course. But if you need to learn more about how to design and create WSDL interfaces, there's certainly lots of other places you can learn about that. So we've provided one for you so that you can use that as the basis for this integration. So I'll be walking through the steps as always. Let me move this out of the way. We'll go to our OIC Service Console, and we want to make sure we get to our projects page, which we are. And now we want to click in to create a new connection. In this case, we're using the SOAP adapter. So by a little search for SOAP, I can find it quickly enough. And we're going to name this a converter interface, because that's going to be kind of what its functionality is. And this is definitely the trigger role for our clients to our integration. And I click Create. Now, for its definition, you'll notice that you could provide a URL to an abstract WSDL if you happen to have that available online somewhere, or we could even use the URL of a WSDL that's actually being used as a service elsewhere and sort of steal that as our interface. But instead, we're going to use something that's far more practical, and I'm going to upload a WSDL file according to the instructions. We have one for you called Converter Interface WSDL. There it is right there. So I'll open that up, and then we'll upload that. But again, and you may want to do this later, but for our purposes, we want to go ahead and just take a look at what that file looks like. Let me open it up in Notepad, and I'll bring that into view. So again, this is a straightforward, simple, almost a hello world kind of interface where we have a greet request element and a greet response element who has a single element for the schema, complex type schema, which is a number coming in and a number text being returned. Of course, the number is as an integer, and the string text is a string, and then the other information. What makes it an abstract WSDL, once again, is the fact that there's no access information. This is not a web service that's been deployed anywhere, or at least not yet, because this file only defines only indicates the definition of the interface, not the actual details of how to contact the service. Later on, let me move this out of the way, after we create our deployed configuration, we'll actually have a real WSDL, a concrete WSDL that we could provide to clients, and we'll use that later when we do our testing. Now, as to the security policy for this guy, if you'll notice in the lab instructions, it indicates that that we have to use either username password token or SAML or OAuth2. We have to have some sort of security because this is our integration, which always requires some kind of credentials being sent in. Now, since testing is a lot easier if we just use username password, we're going to choose that as our policy and click test now. And at this point, all it's doing is just making sure that the WSDL information looks valid and it can configure from there. So we close it, we save it, and close that banner, exit the connection, and we can now see that the trigger SOAP connection based upon that adapter is now in a configured state. We'll see you in the next video. All right, next here in practice 5-2, we're going to actually now create the connection that will be used later in our integration implementation to actually connect to that external web service. And if you'll notice here in the tasks, the pages, I was going to point out that there indeed is URL that we're going to use to access, in this case, the concrete WSDL to that. So I'm going to go ahead and do this now, skip ahead to step 6, because we can always look and see what that WSDL looks like anytime we want. I'm going to move that out of my way, open up another browser tab, and when you can go there, you can actually now see that external service at this URL actually displays and provides its WSDL to include information about how to contact and connect to it. So that's the WSDL for our use case. I'm following the lab instructions beginning with step 1, where we click on here to create a new connection, again, based upon a SOAP adapter, again. But this time, we're going to only be in the invoke role. We're simply invoking this service, not the trigger role. And we'll give a name for this. We'll call it the number converter service. And I click create. All right. So now it's time to copy and paste that same URL I just showed you here in the browser tab in for our WSDL URL. We've already validated that's valid. Notice there's a whole bunch of other optional properties that we could provide for, like ignoring timestamps or suppressing the insertion, enabling two-way SSL. None of those are required for this particular SOAP-based web service. And then for security policy, unlike what we had to do for our inbound to our integration, we have to honor whatever the security policy is supported for that particular external web service. In this particular case, that particular web service doesn't have any security policy, so therefore we need to indicate that so OIC, when it connects to it, says, I'll just do a straight connection. I don't have to provide any security credentials, and he won't. So let's test that. And again, test. And quickly we get a confirmation that we can connect. We click on save. And now we click on go back. And our new number converter service connection is configured. See you in the next video. All right, moving on to practice 5-3, we're going to create the new integration and essentially in this particular part of it, go ahead and configure the trigger and configure the connection to call the external service and do all the subsequent mapping. As always, I'll move this out of the way so I can start with task 1 and you can follow along. On the integrations panel, click here to add, click here to create, and again, this is going to be an application pattern. We need a name for this integration. So the lab instructions tell me to call it convert number to text, and everything else remains the same. Click on create. All right, now we need to select an appropriate trigger. We decided to go with that SOAP trigger since we've already brought that in, and we're going to simply call it convert number. Notice now there's not a whole lot of work to do to configure the interface, and the reason why is it's already looking at that abstract WSDL. We just have to select which operation on that WSDL that we want. Well, there's only one. Okay, so the greeting operation automatically brings in the request and response object associated with that, and we are going to continue on. Do we need to configure any headers? For this use case, we do not. If we clicked yes, we'd have opportunities to define additional SOAP or HTTP headers. And here's our summary page, and we click finish, and we're done. All right, so let's click save and then move on to step 14. Step 14 says let's go ahead and define the business identifiers once again. Now you start to get the hang of how this works most of the time. And notice that in the field here, we don't really have a whole lot of sources. In fact, the only thing we could choose is this number that's been provided. So that's a good business identifier. And if we wanted to, I could rename it, but looks good to me. I'll click away from the panel to close that and click up here to save that. Okay, so now the trigger is configured along with a mapper to send as a response back to our SOAP client. What we want to do next, beginning with step 18, is hover right over here, right below the trigger, and we're going to look for an invoke for a service. This is the number converter service we want to invoke. And again, we need a name for the endpoint, so we decided to call this get text. In the real world, I'd be spending more time coming up with meaningful descriptions for all our endpoints, better for documentation down the road. All right, now that we have that, let's go ahead and select, this is based upon a WSDL now, so this real service has one or more ports. In this case, he has two of them. The instructions say to select the number conversion SOAP, not the SOAP 1-2, and then select the number to words operation. Again, there could be more than that, and again, the automatic population from the WSDL is the SOAP request and response objects that are associated with that. Go ahead and click on continue. Again, no header configurations need to be made, so I can move on past that. I have now the summary of this invoke, and we click finish. And with that done, we're going to head and click save. And as always, once you configure an invoke, you're going to need now to do something with the map editor as this map action came in automatically for us. So instructions say to go in and open the map editor, expand over to the target body. We can see that there is a number to words within the body, and within that there's a UBI num value that needs to be mapped. So where we're going to get that value from is back here in the source on convert number request that came in, and we're going to take the number that was provided by our client, map it to there, click on validate, and now that's been confirmed, we can dismiss the banner and click the go back arrow to exit the mapper, and we click save once again to save our work so far. All right, now get the hang of this. Now that we're done with our implementation, we can now map the logic that goes back to our client. So step 34, we're going to this convert number mapper, which is the response. The instructions say, well, okay, now go ahead and expand that get text response that you got. In this case, there is a number to words result. And then over here under convert number is where we're going to provide that information to back to our SOAP client. Again, we'll click validate and dismiss the banner and exit the map editor. Now that that's done and we save it, I can now click on the back out of my integration design canvas, returning to my project design page. We'll see you in the next video. Practice 5-4 is next, and you may be able to skip this one if you already have your own SOAP testing tool that you use all the time. Not everybody needs to start from scratch. If you've been working with WSDL and SOAP for a while now, you may have your favorite testing tool. In fact, since it's one of the most popular ones, could very well be the SOAP UI testing client. But if you already have yours, you can kind of skip over this and use what you prefer. What I'm going to do is walk you through a little bit of what's involved in installing this, downloading and installing it. And then when I do the next practice where I do my testing, I'll be using SOAP UI. So let's get started here just real quickly. Obviously, since I've already installed it, I'm not going to download and install it again. But if you click on that URI or that URL that is provided, it takes you to this download page where we ask you to click on this download SOAP UI open source. And from there, basically, it just allows you to save that to your desktop so that you can install that a little bit later on. Well, obviously already installed that, so I'm not going to install it again, but I will point to you that there's all kinds of options you have when you do the install and you execute it and so forth. What I would recommend that when you do select to run it, just go ahead and don't worry about other kinds of endpoint explorer and other features which you're not going to need. All right, so once you have that set up, I went ahead and started my SOAP UI. I'm working in version 5.7.2. You don't have to be in this version. You can be in an older one, or there might be a newer one by the time you're watching it. What I typically do, though, is I try to avoid getting too cluttered on my desktop. So usually once it opens up, I'll just go ahead and minimize this start page to kind of get it out of my way. And we'll be using this a little bit later on. We'll see you in the next video. Moving ahead to the last practice, 5-5, now that the integration has been completed and configured, and you have a SOAP testing client, probably SOAP UI. We're going to go ahead and activate the integration, and once we do that, we'll kind of show you how you can get information for doing the testing, and below that I will be launching the SOAP UI application, and the step-by-step instructions I'll be doing are the same that are on here using the SOAP UI client. Again, you can extrapolate yourself if you're using a different SOAP testing tool. So let's get started with step one. I go to my